Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Power does not announce its arrival, nor does it declare its transformation. It shifts, adapts, and rewrites itself in ways that are often imperceptible until the world it governs is no longer the one that existed before. The structures of democracy that once seemed immovable are giving way to a force that does not require elections, does not seek legitimacy through votes, and does not need the people to justify its rule. The consolidation of wealth has not merely created economic disparity, it has rewritten the very nature of governance. What was once mediated by elected officials is now shaped by those who own the financial, technological, and legal infrastructures that dictate the conditions of life itself. Governments no longer regulate billionaires. Billionaires regulate governments. The transformation is not violent, nor is it immediately visible. It is quiet, seamless, and absolute. Nick Land's concept of accelerationism suggests that capitalism and technology are evolving beyond human control, that economic systems are self-perpetuating mechanisms that no longer require political intervention to expand. This is what has happened with the ultra-wealthy. They do not need to lobby for power because power has become an inevitable extension of financial dominance. The wealthiest individuals do not participate in democracy as it was originally designed. They exist outside of it, shaping its limits, while remaining untouched by its regulations. They are not policymakers in the traditional sense, but they do not need to be. Their influence does not stem from holding office, it stems from owning the infrastructure upon which governance depends. This is why regulatory attempts seem futile, why taxation policies are debated endlessly but rarely enacted in meaningful ways. The system itself accelerates toward consolidation, not by conspiracy but by design. Hannah Arendt's distinction between authority and power becomes critical in understanding this shift. Authority requires legitimacy, a contract between the rulers and the ruled. Power, however, does not. Power exists wherever influence can be exerted without the need for approval. This is what makes the rule of billionaires so fundamentally different from traditional governance. They do not require validation. They do not need public trust. They simply exist at the center of decision-making structures, influencing economies, laws, and even public discourse without needing to seek permission. The result is a world where the mechanisms of democracy still function, but the decisions that define society are made elsewhere. The people continue to vote, protest, and debate, but the course of governance remains untouched by these expressions of civic engagement. Power has detached itself from democratic authority and become something entirely new. Antoinette Rouvroy and Bernard Stiegler's theories on algorithmic governance suggest that political decision-making is increasingly outsourced to data-driven systems. Democracy is no longer a process of deliberation. It is a function of predictive analytics, engagement metrics, and algorithmic manipulation. This is what makes the role of billionaires in modern governance so uniquely effective. They do not need to pass laws to shape society. They own the platforms where political discourse occurs, the digital spaces where public opinion is formed, the financial systems that dictate the priorities of entire economies. Meta's removal of fact-checking before the 2024 US election was not just a corporate decision. It was an act of governance. It dictated what could be seen, what could be debated, and what could be ignored. Social media has not merely replaced traditional journalism, it has replaced the function of public deliberation itself. Governance is no longer about legislation, it is about visibility. Those who control information do not need electoral mandates, they control the conditions under which democracy is perceived to exist. Wendy Brown's critique of neoliberalism explains why democratic engagement feels increasingly futile. Under neoliberal logic, every aspect of civic life is transformed into a market function. Citizens are no longer political actors, they are competitors within an economic system that dictates their level of influence. The billionaire class does not need to dismantle democracy by force. It only needs to allow neoliberal ideology to run its course, ensuring that every political action becomes something that can be commodified, analysed, and ultimately absorbed into a system where economic power dictates political possibility. Protests, campaigns, and movements are not suppressed, they are monetized. Outrage is profitable. Resistance becomes another data point in a system that rewards engagement over change. This is why activism, no matter how powerful, often struggles to result in meaningful shifts. The structures that govern society are no longer responsive to public will, they are responsive to capital. Shoshana Zuboff's theory of surveillance capitalism takes this one step further, arguing that digital platforms do not just reflect public sentiment, but actively shape and predict behavior. Billionaires who control these platforms do not need to campaign for political influence. Their platforms dictate reality itself. If governance is the ability to shape the world in which people live, then tech giants already function as de facto governments. Their decisions about what content is amplified, what narratives gain traction, what information disappears beneath the algorithmic threshold, these are acts of governance more impactful than legislation. The people still believe they are making choices, engaging in political discourse, participating in democracy. But the range of available choices has already been narrowed, curated, and optimized for outcomes that benefit those who own the platforms. The illusion of participation remains, but the fundamental mechanism of control has shifted. Yashka Mounk's analysis of the new oligarchy highlights how liberal democracy is being eroded, not by external enemies, but by internal economic realities. Governments no longer set the boundaries of what is possible. Billionaires do. The most significant political decisions of the past decade, climate policies, pandemic responses, economic bailouts, have been shaped by the interests of economic elites rather than the electorate. Leaders do not govern independently. They negotiate within constraints set by those who control markets, industries, and digital infrastructures. This is why regulation fails. This is why corporate accountability is an illusion. The rules of governance are written not in parliaments, but in boardrooms. Jean Baudrillard's theory of simulacra suggests that democracy no longer exists as a functional system, only as an image of itself. Elections are held, debates take place, policies are announced, but none of it alters the fundamental trajectory of governance. The decisions that matter are made beyond the reach of the electorate. Democracy has become a performance, a ritual that sustains the illusion of public influence while ensuring that real power remains untouched. The billionaire class does not oppose democracy because it no longer needs to. It has simply evolved beyond it. The question is not whether democracy can survive. The question is whether it has already been replaced. Transformation of power is not something that happens with sudden force, but through the slow recalibration of control. It is not an event, but a process, one that unfolds within the structures people assume still function as they once did. Democracy, as it was originally conceived, depended on a delicate balance between representation, accountability, and public engagement. That balance no longer exists. What remains is a system that continues to operate in name, but has been hollowed out by forces that do not need the consent of the governed to exert control. The billionaire class does not need to win elections because elections do not determine the course of governance. Wealth has moved beyond influence. It is now the very structure upon which political power rests. Nick Land's accelerationist theory suggests that capitalism and technological systems evolve beyond human oversight, driven by an internal logic that resists regulation. This explains why billionaires continue to amass unprecedented levels of wealth, even as governments attempt to rein them in. The system is not failing, it is succeeding on its own terms. Regulation is ineffective because the economic structures that produce inequality are self-reinforcing. No matter how many policies are proposed to curb corporate dominance, the financial mechanisms that sustain billionaire control remain untouched. The state reacts, but it does not dictate. It manages crises, but it does not solve them. It responds to wealth, but it does not redistribute it in a meaningful way. Hannah Arendt's understanding of power and authority sheds light on why this shift has occurred. Authority is derived from legitimacy, from the recognition that governance must serve the interests of the people. Power, however, requires no such justification. It exists wherever it is exercised without resistance. The billionaire class does not need the public's approval to shape policy. Their influence is not contingent upon persuasion or representation. It is embedded within the structures that define how decisions are made. They do not need to govern directly when they own the systems upon which governance depends. Financial markets dictate economic policy more than legislators do. Technology platforms determine public discourse more than traditional media does. The justice system serves those with the means to manipulate it rather than those it was designed to protect. Antoinette Rouvroy and Bernard Stiegler's concept of algorithmic governance reveals the mechanisms through which this power is exercised. Decision-making is no longer a process of debate, but of data-driven optimization. Social media does not simply reflect public opinion, it shapes it. Financial markets do not just react to political events, they determine them. Predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, and digital surveillance ensure that governance is no longer about negotiation, but about preempting opposition before it materializes. The billionaire class does not rely on laws to maintain control. It relies on the ability to dictate the conditions under which laws are written, enforced, and interpreted. Wendy Brown's critique of neoliberalism explains why democratic engagement feels increasingly futile. Under neoliberal logic, every aspect of life is reduced to a market transaction. Political activism is commodified. Protests become moments of spectacle rather than instruments of change. Outrage is monetized rather than suppressed. The system does not need to eliminate dissent. It only needs to ensure that dissent is absorbed, processed, and rendered ineffective within the mechanisms of digital capitalism. Resistance is permitted so long as it does not challenge the fundamental structure of power. The illusion of engagement persists, but the outcomes remain unchanged. Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism theory adds another dimension to this transformation. Control is no longer exerted through force, but through the ability to predict and shape behavior. The billionaire class does not govern by imposing rules. It governs by designing the environments in which decisions are made, the platforms people use, the algorithms that curate content, the financial incentives that shape industries. All of these function as tools of governance that require no public accountability. The mechanisms of democracy still exist, but they operate within a system where true political agency has been replaced by algorithmic influence. Yashka Mounk's work on the decline of liberal democracy describes how governments now function as intermediaries between the public and the economic forces that shape policy. Politicians still campaign, laws are still passed, and elections are still held, but the scope of what can be changed is constrained by the interests of those who control markets, industries, and digital infrastructure. This is why attempts at wealth taxation, corporate regulation, or social reform rarely succeed. The systems that uphold the power of billionaires are deeply embedded within the very institutions that would be responsible for challenging them. Jean Baudrillard's simulacrum theory suggests that democracy now exists as an image rather than a reality. The symbols of governance remain, but the substance has been replaced by a system that operates beyond public oversight. The billionaire class does not need to dismantle democracy because democracy has already been restructured in a way that accommodates their control. Policy is no longer shaped by the electorate, but by financial and technological ecosystems that are owned, not governed. What people perceive as political debate is often nothing more than a simulation of engagement, where outcomes have already been determined long before they reach the public sphere. This is not the collapse of democracy in the traditional sense. It is its evolution into something else, something that retains the language of governance while operating on entirely different principles. The world is not witnessing a crisis of political legitimacy so much as a shift in the nature of who wields control. Power has always belonged to those who shape reality, and in this era, reality is no longer defined by governments alone. It is curated by those who own the platforms, the financial systems, and the legal frameworks that determine the course of global decision-making. The question is not whether democracy will survive, it is whether it has already been replaced by a system that no longer requires it. Power no longer asks for permission, it no longer needs legitimacy, nor does it require validation from the systems that once defined governance. The billionaire class has moved beyond the constraints of democratic accountability, beyond the need to persuade, beyond the reach of regulation. What was once a contest between political ideologies has become a quiet consolidation of control, where influence is not earned through debate, but acquired through ownership. Those who dictate the future no longer do so through policy alone. They do so through economic leverage, technological dominance, and the ability to shape reality itself. Nick Land's accelerationism suggests that the mechanisms of capitalism and technology evolve beyond human control, moving toward their own inevitable conclusions. This is evident in how billionaire power has ceased to be something that can be regulated. The system itself is designed to produce extreme wealth concentration, and every attempt to correct it is absorbed into the same forces that drive its expansion. Governments still claim authority, still act as though they are the arbiters of national policy, but power, real power, resides elsewhere. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking Podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.